Welcome to CivilNet. My guest is Lara Setrakian, whose name and face is not unknown to those who follow international news. Lara, thank you for being with us on CivilNet.
It's a pleasure to join you, Salpi.
Lara was a reporter in the Middle East for Bloomberg and for ABC News. She is now the creator and editor and top experimenter, is that fair, at a new site, a new project called SyriaDeeply.com. And it is, if I describe it very briefly, a means of trying to use old journalism and new journalism in order to try to really make us understand something really difficult. Is that fair?
That makes sense completely. It is SyriaDeeply.org. It is a social enterprise. We are fusing old journalism, the best of it, and new media, digital tools of the day to do exactly what you said, to make something very complicated easier to understand, primarily for an American audience that really has a growing thirst for understanding what's happening in the world. We just need new tools to help them get it.
Let me ask you a backwards sort of question. Why Syria? Why not Palestine deeply? Why not Middle East deeply? Why Syria specifically?
This whole project grew of a certain frustration that hit me in February of this year, that the Syria conflict in particular wasn't being explained enough, wasn't getting enough coverage, wasn't getting the right kind of coverage, that the conflict was escalating before our very eyes, that by Middle Eastern standards, I wasn't the foremost expert on Syria, but compared to my friends and colleagues in the US, I had a lot to share, and we didn't have a way to share it. So we needed to find some way where, for this crisis that had been probably the most difficult to understand of all of the Arab Spring uprisings, because journalists had such a hard time getting in, because the environment there had been so heavily censored for so long, because of the nature of the conflict itself, and now because it's dragged on for such a long time, and there's a proliferation of social media, YouTube videos, tweets. There is every which way to get some information. It's just very difficult to piece it all together and to figure out what's correct. So that frustration gave rise to this feeling that, we need to try something different. And Syria is the perfect case study. So that's when I took some time off to focus down on how we fuse news and technology. And that's when we had some incredible partners and friends come on board to help us do it. We have Prezi, Google+, SoundCloud, all tools that we're using to create and distribute this content in new ways. And we found that with this hypothesis that, we really want to take one issue and go deeply. We're tired of just seeing the headlines. We want to really understand the meat and potatoes of any given issue. That's why we decided to go with just Syria deeply instead of doing Middle East deeply or anything more broad. For once, let's pick one thing and stick to it and really try to understand. And if this model for Syria, then we would scale it on. Other issues we could do Iran deeply, North Korea deeply, Congo deeply, Eurasia deeply, and then we can also go by subject area, like drug war deeply, global poverty deeply, energy deeply. It's about first and foremost innovating the content architecture. How do you put all the pieces together? How do you visualize what's going on with maps, with infographics, etc., so that you really digest it. It's easier to just take it all in, and then we'll from there step up the technology to something more sophisticated.
Well, we certainly understand the challenges. We ourselves are trying to be Armenia deeply. Tell us if this is right, that in the case of Syria, one of the things that's made the process so very difficult, and probably will make your life difficult as well, is that you have one set of news sources, all of whom are engaged and have something at stake. You have another set of news sources who meanwhile, and don't really know a whole lot, whether they're just amateurs in the region or whether they're, armchair journalists out somewhere. And then you have those who really do know, but they're not on site. And you need to now make sense of all of that for us.
Definitely. I talk about having a kind of scatter plot of the story so that when you try to boil it down into one sentence, like our site is going to have one sentence at the top that tells you what's going on right now. How do you boil it down to one sentence? Well, if you have the big picture in mind and you're watching all those different news sources and understanding, okay, Russia Today has the Assad interview, CBS News is running this, ABC is saying that, New York Times has an interesting piece on the Kurds. When you see it all and you get practiced in seeing it all, the more experience we have staring at one story, the better we get at figuring out what's most relevant and what's coming next. So that makes it easier for us to pick it out. If you think about it, Salpi, I never thought of this until your question now, but it's really like any other beat reporter. In the United States, you'd be assigned a beat. You'd be a metro reporter. You'd be a crime reporter. You'd focus on law and justice or medical or something, or science. You know, we're basically making ourselves beat reporters on foreign news so that we can do a better job of presenting those stories, especially to a Western public.
Given all of the interests that the sides, and obviously not the two sides, I don't know how many sides there are there anymore, you'll tell us in a minute, given the interest of the sides to get their story out, are they helping, are they on your side for this to be better understood, or do they like the fact that this place really is not being understood today, as you said, the way no other Middle Eastern country has been misunderstood?
There are definitely at least a dozen competing narratives. So every side wants its story told and presented as truth. We have to be extremely careful. It's easier for us to reach the opposition than it is for us to reach the regime, for many obvious reasons. First of all, most of them are based abroad at this point, most of the ones who are looked to as representatives. So it's easier to reach them physically, but also, you know, are we going to have as easy a time trying to get an interview with President Bashar al-Assad as we would be to get the head of the SNC? No, it's much easier to reach the head of SNC. That guy is more keen to reach, especially a Western audience. So we were very mindful of that. You know, you can be objective, but then again, a lot of this is going to be shaped by who you can reach, who you have access to. So it's going to be a very conscientious attempt at getting this right and remaining neutral. We're not rooting for any side of this conflict. We're just trying to help, especially, again, that Western audience get a fuller picture. Who are the Kurds? Who are the Alawites? Why does it matter? Where are the Christians in all of this? These are basics that we don't have in the West. We don't have them fully baked. It's interesting, you know, I think here in the Middle East, even though people deeply appreciate, no pun intended, what we're doing with this project, you know, it takes some time for them to understand, yeah, what we're really doing here is getting a Western audience caught up with the basics, with the main issues, so that when they see the headlines, they make sense. Everything else they see out there is going to be more valuable once they understand the fundamentals of this country and this society.
The proliferation of social media, of course, obviously in many ways makes what you're doing even possible, not just easier, but in some ways it's going to make your life harder, maybe, in the sense that both the experts will be following and expecting additional information, and the non-experts will be looking and trying to understand, you know, from the very beginning. And you need to feed both of those needs.
Absolutely. It's a big challenge for us. And what I think we're doing right, and we'll find out as we test the hypothesis and iterate and take this into newer and newer versions, is we're putting a lot of the background content, like welcome to Syria, here's what the country's about, here's who's in the government, who's in the opposition. We're putting that in a separate section called the Syria files, where you have that background data. So if you need it, it's there for you. If you don't need it, you can go straight to the headlines. So part of it is how you actually do the architecture of the site. And the rest is a lot about our approach. I mean, we just stumbled upon, this is the way journalists stumble upon things, an American from Baltimore who's fighting with the Free Syrian Army in Aleppo. That's interesting to everyone. And it's more a question for, it's interesting, the expert is interesting to the person who's coming at the subject for the first time. And the questions we ask are kind of pretty much the same for each. For another subject, like the strategic value of the Battle of Aleppo, we have to be conscious about how we ask questions and how we present the piece itself. I think you can present very intelligent content to a very broad audience of people, and it'll have value for both the experts and the first-time visitor, as long as you respect the intelligence of both groups and know what you're offering and know why it's important to both sets of people. You always have to know your audience. But there's one element of this, Salpi, that does guide us, which is from the start, the main purpose of this, the mission for us, was to serve people, and to serve people we call the curious but confused, where they kind of have an interest in Syria already, they want to understand what's going on. We've seen that there are 7.5 million people a month searching on Google for the Syria story. Those are the people we want to reach, the ones who are searching and need better answers and need a place to understand all of these pieces coming together. So that's who we're conscientiously aiming for.
Lara, since you're talking about the curious and the confused, that's me. Do you want to explain Syria to me in 25 words or less? Or let's make it a little easier. Doha, you were at the meetings. where the oppositions were trying to make sense of their own interrelationships and where they go from here. If you were to explain that briefly to us, the curious and confused, how would you put it?
The Syrian opposition, those who have been challenging President Bashar al-Assad, have been a fractured, disorganized, hard to pull together group of people. They just came together in some modicum of agreement. They built this coalition that's meant to bridge everyone, create a central address so that Western countries can feel good about the opposition, send them more aid, potentially send them weapons, give them literally a fighting chance against the Assad regime. There are going to be huge challenges for them going forward. First of all, just in maintaining that structure that they hammered out in Doha, but also in how they're going to relate to the fighting groups, to the brigades themselves who are doing the actual battlefield work. If the political opposition can really unify with the armed opposition, then they stand a chance of advancing against the Assad regime. The Assad regime has its supporters, it has its base, it has a lot of advantages. It clearly thinks it can stamp out this rebellion.
And still does.
That's where it really becomes a toss-up as to whether the opposition can really find the momentum it needs and whether the Assad regime has any plan other than to keep fighting and trying to stamp out this kind of dissent.
And this tentative coalition is capable of absolving concerns, worries that there are external forces driving this and not really internal Syrian opposition forces?
It's hard to say. On one hand, they have more legitimacy because the people, the individuals now leading the opposition, those who were selected in Doha, they have better names, they have better reputations, they have better support bases inside the country. Muaz Khatib, Suhair Atassi, they have their supporters. So they are more legitimate in that sense. But the fact that this was shepherded through by a U.S.-led initiative, the Riyadh Safe Plan, does not help its legitimacy inside Syria. It makes it look like another foreign-backed opposition group. So I think it's a toss-up, Salpi.
Well, Lara, it's clear why so many people are calling you the young journalist to watch. We're watching you. We're going to keep watching you, and we hope you'll join us more frequently. We'll certainly watch SyriaDeeply.org grow.
Anytime. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you for watching CivilNet.